I don't think you can overstate how bad this result was for the Liberal Party. They have a vote under 20%. They are going to have a very small number of seats in this parliament. In the vast majority of the state, they're no longer one of the two main parties. And, maybe they bounce back from that. But it's a very challenging position from an election where the polls, at least on the right wing of politics, don't look that different to what we're seeing in the federal polls.
And how is One Nation looking at this point? Of course, the vote counting continuing.
Yeah, so One Nation's vote is over 20%. It's pretty clear that they're going to end up with more of the vote than the Liberal Party. When you get over 20%, you don't necessarily win a lot of seats. And what's happening is Labor is winning most seats. One Nation, they look like they've locked in about one seat. We think they might end up around four. Hopefully we're going to learn a lot today, because this is when they're going to start doing new preference counts that reflect who actually did come in the top two. But, that's a remarkable result for a party that hasn't won a lower house seat ever outside of Queensland.
And did we learn any more about that support for One Nation, who it was at the expense of?
Yeah, look, it's mostly at the expense of the Liberal Party. That's worth emphasising. Or, maybe a few people who voted for other right-wing minor parties in the past. But there is some support that's come away from Labor, and there are some areas where effectively One Nation is a more effective opponent to Labor than the Liberal Party were. So I'm thinking of seats like Elizabeth and Light on the northern edge of Adelaide, where One Nation, I don't think they're going to win either of those seats, but they came close. And just in the northern suburbs and the southern suburbs of Adelaide generally, One Nation have outpolled the Liberal Party. And so I think they have taken some votes away from Labor as well. But mostly, this is a change that's happening within the right-wing minority of the state, rather than something that's affecting, the progressive majority. Labor still, I think, will have won quite a large two-party preferred majority. Even if you calculated two-party preferred against One Nation, they again would have won it quite comfortably. But, there are a few signs of trouble in a few areas.
Why do the results matter nationally, and is this going to have an effect on campaigns moving forward?
Well, I mean, to be honest, there's not a lot of local specific reasons in South Australia to see this trend. What we saw last year was One Nation picking up support in national polls. And then at the start of this year, the pollsters started asking about One Nation in the state polls. And we've seen this trend in every state. So in a sense, South Australia is just the first example. It's the first test for them. It's the first test of, are people really going to do what these polls say, or is this just an artifact of the polling? And I think this does show, the federal election's a long way away, but it does show that it's meaningful. If there was an election, I think a lot of people would vote for One Nation. And so in that sense, South Australia is an example. The other thing I'd say specifically about federal politics is if you compare this result to the federal polls, again, it has One Nation a little bit ahead of the coalition in the most federal polls recently, but Labor is in a much weaker position federally than the Malinowskis government was in South Australia. And so if we had an election like this, again, you'd have a lot of seats we couldn't call on election night. But we were able to call this election for Labor because they won so comfortably, even though there was a lot of seats where we didn't really know what their margin was going to be. If this happened in a federal election, I think it would be a lot closer, and probably we wouldn't actually be able to determine who won the election on election night.